everyone. Excuse me. Welcome everyone to the National Committee on US-China Relations 2018 China Town Hall. The Paul and Marcia Wythes Center on Contemporary China is proud to be a local sponsor for this important conversation on US and China relations. This town hall has two parts. Before Secretary Rice's interview with Committee President Steve Orlins, Keith Abell, Committee Treasurer and Board Member, will speak on trade wars and cold peace, redefining the US-China relationship in the Pacific century. Some of yesterday's headlines emphasize the importance of our economic and trade relations with China. US-China tensions flare as Secretary of State Pompeo meets with counterparts in Beijing. Pompeo and Chinese Foreign Minister trade jabs during meeting. China reprimands US for trade dispute and arms sales to Taiwan. US-China tensions overshadow North Korea as Pompeo visits Beijing. This is because the United States has levied an unprecedented number of tariffs in an effort to punish China for unfair trade practices. This is not the first time we've taxed China. In 2002, the Bush administration imposed tariffs on Chinese steel. In 2009, the Obama administration applied tariffs to automobile tires coming from China. Economic analysis of the aftermath of these tariffs tend to show a dubious connection between the intended purpose and the hoped for results. It is also questionable whether this has improved our ability to negotiate with China on other key issues, such as North Korea and regional stability in Asia. Given the significance of China, it's essential to understand this current trade conflict with this important policy and trade partner. Therefore, I'm pleased that the Center is able to bring Mr. Abell to campus so that he can shed light on our current trade conflict with China and perhaps also a way forward. Mr. Abell works in the international investment space and focuses on Asia and China. Previously, he worked for Goldman Sachs as Vice President in Mergers and Acquisitions. He also worked at Blackstone Group, where he led their Asian private equity efforts. Thereafter, he founded the GSC Group and the Tishman-inspired China Fund, both of which focus on real estate investments in China. Mr. Abell's most recent venture is Sungate Asset Management, which facilitates real estate investments in the U.S. by Chinese entities and individuals. So I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Abell, and please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you all for coming today. It's a timely subject. I opened up the Wall Street Journal today, and on the front, anybody read the Wall Street Journal? Front page, US-China strains deepen. I mean, nothing happened. There was a little, spat, few aggressive words, front page. That tells you that this US-Chinese relationship is forefront on everybody's mind. And not because it's good. Actually, in my opinion, relations between the United States and China are as bad as they've ever been in my life. And I would argue, as bad as they've been since the Korean War, when the American and Chinese soldiers were shooting at each other from opposite sides, and General Douglas MacArthur had the bright idea that he proposed to President Truman that he be given permission to drop bombs on China. So to say that this is the worst time since then is saying a lot. When the Korean War ended, obviously we didn't drop bombs on China. But what we did do is we began a 20-year period of almost total diplomatic and economic isolation of China from the West. You could argue that this was, in fact, the coldest corner of the Cold War. And I'm proud to say, as a treasurer of the National Committee on US-China Relations, that the group responsible, or at least the group at the forefront, of breaking the ice of that Cold War relationship was, in fact, the National Committee on US-China Relations. Anybody know how? We organized a ping pong game. And it was the first time China opened it up to the West. It was to allow ping pong players from America to come to China and play in a ping pong game. Anybody see Forrest Gump? I mean, they popularized that in that movie. Forrest Gump being one of the ping pong players. Lighthearted thing, but it did set the stage for Nixon's visit to China in 1972. which ultimately, paved the way for China's entry into the global community more broadly, its economic rise, and its emergence in this 21st century as a superpower on its way to rival the United States. Which leads us to the central question that I'd like to talk about today. Where exactly has this remarkable trajectory led us? Now that China has emerged, what has it become? And what does it mean to the United States? Where do the threats of trade wars fit into this historical context? Have we entered a new phase, or have we come full circle? Has the arc of history led us right back to the Cold War policies of containment? Now, this is not the way it was supposed to play out. It's certainly not what I predicted when I first went to China in 1979 and started working there in 1984. I had the privilege, and I would say amazing good luck, to begin my professional life in China as a China specialist at what was literally the opening bell of modern China's relationship with the West. Most of us back then anticipated, or maybe I would say hoped, that a modern, open China would eventually follow the path of other developing nations. China would join the liberal economic and diplomatic order that was crafted and led by the United States since World War II. There was a sense of inevitability that this would occur. This was a new 20th century incarnation of the 19th century concept of America's manifest destiny, but it was bigger. The ideological foundations of the American experiment would spread throughout the entire world, bringing democracy, prosperity, and peaceful global cooperation everywhere. Well, in hindsight, this was a tad presumptuous. It did not take into account the possibility that other cultures, such as China, might have other ways of looking at both history and destiny. As long as it was poor and weak, China was more than willing to play along in the US-led international order in order to entice the US and its allies to support its development and modernization. Nonetheless, it was always suspicious about US power and motives. In quiet and unpublicized discussions, it would defend its right to carve a different path if the power dynamic should shift in such a way as to make that possible. And today, the dynamic has shifted. China has emerged as a global superpower. It is openly declaring its intention to carve its own path and its right to do so. Well, this is a disappointment to those who believe that China's economic liberalization was a step on the road to political liberalization. That the development of a middle class would lead inevitably to the establishment of civil society, open discourse, and eventually to democracy. At the moment, China seems to be heading in an entirely different direction. Should this surprise us? I would argue that it should not. Our opening to China and China's opening to us was a cynical calculation on both sides. It was not grounded in shared values, shared culture, shared history, or shared destiny. It was grounded in bare knuckles realpolitik. From the US perspective, ending China's isolation was a Cold War tactic, intended primarily to isolate the Soviet Union. It had little regard to China's own aspirations or culture. Nixon concluded that China in itself was too weak to constitute a very big threat compared to the threat of the Soviet Union. Therefore, it made sense to try to weaken the USSR by removing China from the Soviet equation. Nixon, in effect, wanted to use China as a chess piece to encircle and contain the Soviet Union. Take the China piece off the Soviet side of the table and put it on ours. Obviously, China had an entirely different calculus about its intentions in opening to the West. And it had nothing to do with the US-Soviet relationship. The China that Nixon visited was a poor pre-industrial society, still traumatized by the Great Leap Forward in the 50s and their Cultural Revolution in the 60s. These things and this trauma led to the rise of Deng Xiaoping, and in 1978, to the start of China's economic reform. Deng called it at the time socialism with Chinese characteristics. Actually, it's an Orwellian doublespeak. What it really meant was capitalism. But capitalism that had to be introduced into a socialist economy without giving up power on the part of the Communist Party. Actually, today they call it capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Not surprisingly, Deng found in the United States a welcome partner in this mission to introduce capitalism into China. That's actually the moment in history when I arrived on the China scene. I graduated from Brown University in 1979 with a major in semiotics and a passion for Chinese Kung Fu that led me to try to study from Taoist priests in a Taoist temple on a mountaintop in China. Unfortunately, in 1979, that just simply wasn't in the cards for any young American Brown graduate, or any American for that matter. So instead, I studied with a dentist in Taichung Park instead, in Taiwan. And he was a great Tai Chi teacher, but not a Taoist priest. Side note, my two boys, Isaac, TJ, my wife Kathy, were in the back. We just got back from Wudang Mountain in China, where we did in fact spend a week studying Tai Chi 6 hours a day with the Taoist master in what for me was the realization of a 40-year dream. And it was wonderful. And I recommend Wudang Mountain to everybody. Now, in 1983, I applied to the Lauder Institute, which was a joint program of Wharton and Penn, and I was one of 2 China fellows. There was a class of 50. Over 40 of them were Europe and Latin American fellows. And then there were a handful of North American fellows, but China, 2. Neither of us could read or write a word of Chinese. Both of us could speak more or less fluently. When I graduated, the bankers at Goldman Sachs found my ambitions to participate in the economic rise of China to be both odd and entertaining. Fortunately, they were intrigued enough to let me enter the class of new associates. And those new associates were unanimously convinced that my quaint obsession with this poor, faraway developing country offered absolutely no credible competition in their race to partnership. My first job in China was a 1984 summer consulting job. While still an MBA student, I was advising Xerox on what was one of the first ever US-Chinese joint ventures. Things were incredibly unfair in those days. Xerox could only have a minority stake in a joint venture where they couldn't even pick their own partner. They couldn't even interview candidates. They were just polled. Shanghai, DR, Fujichang, that's it. Shanghai, number 2, copy machine company, that's your partner. The Communist Party had a political officer on site in the factory. All the technology they needed to manufacture was to be transferred, to the Chinese partner. Also, they had to source a certain number of parts and materials locally in China, which China didn't have, at least not good quality. So Xerox in turn had to get its suppliers to come to China, find their own joint venture partners, and transfer their technology too. A minimum percentage of the products they manufactured had to be exported, which was the biggest challenge of all, because in 1984, literally nobody in the world wanted to buy anything manufactured in China, which was certainly going to be of terrible quality. To make things even worse, if Xerox ever managed to make a profit out of this mess, you could not bring that profit in cash out of China. So you had two choices. You could either reinvest it back into China, or you could take the profit out in the form of something you bought in China, like Oriental carpets or something. Xerox could take its profit out in the form of Oriental carpets that it would then have to sell in the United States in order to turn it into cash. They called this a form of counter trade, and it was actually a thing. Did Xerox and American companies like Xerox, did they storm out of the conference rooms, incensed about the unfair terms of investment? Did our politicians hold summits with Chinese leaders demanding a level playing field? Did political candidates campaign on the promise to bring China to heel? Of course not. Everybody was delighted to play along. China was opening to the West. That was the important thing. Baby steps, baby steps. Of course they deserve special consideration. There were huge challenges in introducing a free market into a controlled communist economy. The communist leaders of the most populous country were willing to experiment with American-style capitalism. We need to help them. We'll bend over backwards to accommodate their special requests. China's finally playing our game. What a milestone on the path to America's new brand of manifest destiny in this new American-led age of enlightenment. There were over 1 billion people in poverty. What a market this was going to be if China ever developed into a modern economy. Why invest there under such unfair terms? Well, in boardrooms all across America, executives did the math. You got 1 billion people. They each have 2 armpits. That's 2 billion armpits. Boy, are we going to sell a lot of deodorant. You're laughing, but I'll tell you, I had a conversation in 1984 with the head of Volkswagen China. He had made a 5-year commitment to live in China. And I said, 5 years in China? God, that's a hardship post. I said, why are you doing that? And he said, China doesn't have to develop to a point where they have as many people with cars per capita as Germany or the United States for this to be worthwhile. If China ever develops to the level of Kenya, we're going to sell a lot of cars here. And he was absolutely right. China became at one point responsible for all the profits of Volkswagen. Which brings us to today. The problem we face, ironically, is that both China and the United States have succeeded in what we jointly set out to do. We have provided China with tools to help it on its path to create a modern, technologically advanced, middle-class society and an active participant in the global order and the community of nations. We've provided access to our markets, education in our universities, technology from our companies, investment capital, and most of all, our patience and our tolerance of incredibly asymmetrical and unfair terms of trade and investment. China naturally would like to maintain the status quo. They'd like to keep things as they are, while all the while continuing their rise until eventually they overtake us. That's their manifest destiny. Not surprisingly, many people in America see things a little differently. They argue it's time for China to stop demanding special considerations. As developing countries go, they say it's developed enough. Time to take off the training wheels. Its emerging economy has emerged. It's a tough competitor, and its success in many areas is coming at our expense. It's still believed that our bet on the benefits of China's modernization can and will pay off, but only if we're permitted to compete on a level playing field. There are a few voices in America that are willing to play things the old way any longer. The thinking goes, if we don't fix things now, it could be too late later. The business community has always been China's biggest ally in the United States. But at this point, it has almost universally joined the ranks of China's detractors. And these have historically been, well, basically everybody else. Our politicians have seen the Chinese leadership as brutal communist dictators. Our religious leaders see them as godless atheists. Our academics have seen them as oppressors of free thought. And our journalists have seen them as brutal propagandists and enemies of truth. Indeed, the business community, in its single-minded pursuit of profit, has been China's one reliable friend. But no longer. One increasingly hears China described as a betrayer of free markets, an intellectual property thief and spy, an unfair economic competitor, and a biased regulator with an unjust and anti-foreign legal system. And recently, the military has joined this unhappy party. In response to China's growing military ambitions, which threatens the strategic status quo in the South China Sea. Welcome, my friends, to this brave new world of US-China relations. And to whom has history assigned stewardship of this delicate, complex, and potentially incendiary moment? None other than the administration of Donald J. Trump. Now, let's take a look at Donald J. Trump, his administration, and what he says he's trying to do with China. And let's leave aside the inflammatory rhetoric and whatever you may think about President Trump. Nothing that he has said publicly differs all that much from mainstream thought in its diagnosis of the history or problems that I've just described in the last few minutes. The problem is there's really no clarity about what course of treatment he's proposing. I have no window into the mind or soul of President Trump. But in my career, I've had a fair bit of experience both within China and within the New York City real estate community. And in my opinion, they deserve each other. It is hard to imagine tougher negotiators, bred in harsher climates, more brutally determined to do and say whatever is necessary to advance their agendas. If Richard Nixon, in pursuing his rabid Cold War ambitions, unwittingly fostered the opening of China to the West and its rise, is it too much to hope that Donald Trump, in his single-minded quest for power and contempt for convention, is actually the right man for this moment? Let's consider things from the point of view of the Chinese Communist Party. Above all else, they want power. Always. Maintaining party rule has always been their paramount objective. Not cynically. Many people believe the Communist Party has been good for China and that the future prosperity of China depends on party rule. But whether you believe that or not, they want the power. And what do they fear? Anything that fosters social instability. This was a government formed in revolution. It has an enormous population of poor urban and agricultural workers, hundreds of millions of which are surplus labor in the countryside that want to come into cities that just can't accommodate them fast enough. The party believes that if they don't have enough control over this population, things could descend quickly into chaos and revolt. There are many examples of potential causes of social instability that worry them. I'll give you three big ones. Economic distress, because you're unable to maintain growth and create jobs. Dissident social activism, for example, a vocal pro-democracy movement. or a backlash if the party was unable to protect China's sovereignty and dignity. For example, if they allowed a foreign government to support a Taiwanese independent movement. These are three extremely vulnerable points of party rule, and the Trump administration has wasted no time to take direct aim at each of them. The Chinese economy is an export-driven machine that is highly dependent on access to US markets. Using tariffs to threaten their exports earnings is striking a blow directly into one of their greatest weaknesses. As a tactical move, it's effective. It makes China pay attention, and it makes it clear that the US intends to use whatever leverage it has to push things in the direction we want. And if that's the purpose of these tariffs, then maybe it's a shrewd tactic. It also places into context Trump's alarming decision to have that telephone call during his transition with the president of Taiwan. What did it mean? Was he rejecting the one China policy, which has been the foundation of peaceful coexistence between China, Taiwan, and the United States, for nearly 50 years? Or maybe he was just ignorant. Was he even aware of what he had done? Did he grasp the context and historical significance? Or was he just softening China up before negotiating for what he really wanted? Based on public statements, it's impossible to know. I suppose, my guess, is that Donald Trump at least has a deep visceral understanding of power and leverage, bred as he was in the trenches of New York City real estate. Up to a point, I actually see value in the madman strategy that he seems to employ. It's a Machiavellian tactic, and Nixon liked it too in his Cold War dealings with the USSR. Everybody familiar with the madman strategy? You act like a madman. People don't know what to do. You're unpredictable. In Kung Fu terms, you're the drunken monk. Nobody knows where you're going to come at them next. If we assume that I'm right about this, it also helps explain Donald Trump's behavior towards North Korea. I'm sure you know he's recently announced that he and Kim Jong-un have literally fallen in love. His words. And if you don't think that's crazy, please take out your phones and Google the definition of crazy. So you have to ask, does he completely lack understanding of the history and character of North Korea and the Kim family? Is this another example of a barely literate, childishly naive president stumbling clownishly across the world stage, leaving chaos and confusion in his wake? Or is there another way to look at this? One of the main pillars in Chinese leverage in dealing with the United States is its perceived influence over North Korea. But what if you thought they didn't really have that much influence? What if you thought nothing was really going to stop the North Koreans from nuclearizing, short of outright war, which we're really not going to do? Well, if you really believe that, then it might make sense to cozy up to Kim Jong-un. Show the Chinese that the US has its own lines of communication to North Korea. In other words, take the North Korea piece off the Chinese chessboard, just as Nixon took the China piece off the Soviet chessboard. So, if you look at things this way, Trump is behaving a great deal like Nixon, in his willingness to disregard the rules to advance his agenda. And leaving aside whatever you may think of Nixon, or of Trump for that matter, it offers some comfort that there is at least a method behind his apparent madness in choosing tactics in the international arena. Now, most people that I talk to in China, in fact, think this is the case. They assume that he's crazy like a fox, not just crazy. They think that the US system of government would not elevate an ignorant, glass-breaking buffoon into the most powerful position in the world. Oddly, in this regard, they may have more faith in our American system of government than many Americans do. And also, they are delighted that the United States has retreated from the world stage. voluntarily surrendered any pretension of moral leadership and become the most vocal critic of the international order that we ourselves created in the first place. This provides China with an unexpected historical opportunity to fill the vacuum. And they are doing exactly that with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, investments around the world, efforts to strengthen and redefine their international relationships, and aggressive military posturing in the South China Sea, which sends the message, if there's not a new sheriff in town, there's at least another sheriff in town. And more importantly, from China's perspective, the Trump administration has succeeded in massively deflating the global appeal of our American system of government. It is scorned as a flawed model and not something that China or anybody else should aspire to. Domestically within China, this is an invaluable gift to the Chinese Communist Party. The party detests and resents decades of US moralizing about human rights, free speech, free elections, all of which constitute in their minds an existential threat to party power. Unfortunately, and perhaps unwittingly, the Trump administration has taken these chess pieces off the China board as well. Are these rational trade-offs for the US to make? We can't know the answer because we don't know exactly what Trump is trying to accomplish, if he even knows. It's possible he's just operating on instinct, tossing stink bombs as he goes, under the theory that whatever comes next, the first step is just shaking things up and showing China its vulnerability and sending a message that the world has changed. One thing for sure, this is an entirely new approach to dealing with China. So let's take his obsessions with tariffs and the trade deficit. On the surface, this focus on trade numbers is a simplistic and anachronistic way to evaluate a complex economic relationship between the two world's largest economies. There are so many technical weaknesses in trade statistics that I could spend all my time deconstructing methodologies and debating the meaning of statistics. But I'll leave that to others, particularly because I know there are some economic professors in the room that would know better than I do what's wrong. But I'd like to focus on the broader context. Trade numbers may be an easy to understand framework to score political points at home. It supports the false narrative that China has stolen American jobs. We're just much richer than China per capita. Chinese wages are lower than ours. They make things more cheaply than we do. So we can afford to buy more of what they make than they can buy of what we make. Trump can't change that. He could theoretically drive labor-intensive industries out of China into Southeast Asia. That would hurt China. It would improve our trade numbers, but it wouldn't help us. A trade war could drive US companies to invest less in China and invest more elsewhere. And Trump says they'll bring their factories back home. But I don't think so. Actually, the US would be the absolute stupidest choice for them because the Chinese will retaliate in this trade war. That would box them out of the second largest market in the world. They're going to move their factories. They should move them anywhere but the US. There would be tremendous disruption to the US economy. It would be more expensive for US consumers and companies to buy many goods. It would create inflationary pressures. It would reduce or even eliminate corporate earnings growth. And it would establish a period of uncertainty while the world adjusts to a new reality. The US stock market, by the way, is clearly betting that none of this is going to happen because it's achieving new highs daily. The Chinese stock market is betting exactly the opposite. It's sinking like a stone. Who's right? The Chinese are right. Say goodbye to our bull market. If the US is right, then run out and buy Chinese stocks because they're undervalued. In sum, I believe that tariffs will hurt us much more than help us. They will also force China to diversify its economy away from selling low labor cost goods to the US market. It will strengthen trade relationships with other developed markets, provide assistance to emerging economies to help them become important new markets. It will grow its consumer economy, deepen its participation in multinational bodies, to isolate the US and develop greater capabilities in higher value-added industries, such as biotech, aerospace, clean energy, and artificial intelligence. But you know, China's already doing all those things. This is their vision for overtaking the US as the world's economic and technological leader. A trade war is only going to make it clear that that's the right plan. In other words, if the war does not cripple China terminally, it will increase its resolve and hasten the day when it realizes these goals. And that will not make things better for the United States. I would argue that a focus on trade is fighting yesterday's war. It's unsuited to the battle we really face, which is to position the US to compete effectively against the future China that is technologically advanced, global, and wealthy. Trying to hold them back won't work forever. Eventually, the wheels of history will turn, and China will rise. We need to prepare ourselves to compete in the world to come, not in a world that time has already left behind. You know, my own prescription is this. We should demand a level playing field in not just trade, but also in investment. We need China to accept our intellectual property rights, to grant far greater access for US companies to establish operations within China. We need China to discontinue formal and informal barriers that make it difficult for US companies to succeed. And we need China to allow US financial institutions to invest more freely in Chinese equity, debt, and commodity markets. I believe that US companies will succeed in China if allowed to fight on fair terms. My hope is that these goals are shared by the Trump administration. And when the dust clears on the tariff issue, we will find that progress has been made in these other critical areas. So, I'm rooting for President Trump on this one. I'm hoping that wittingly or unwittingly, truly mad or just pretending, that the end result of the saber rattling is not a trade war at all, but an evolution of the US-China relationship towards a more level playing field. It is inevitable that the US will resist surrendering leadership to a rising China. Just as it is inevitable that China will aspire to such leadership. The arc of history has led us to this moment, and nothing presidents or parties do, or fail to do, will fundamentally change it. So let's compete. That's what you get when you lead the entire world to embrace a capitalist model. But my hope and desire is that both nations will compete fairly and respectfully. I think both of us and the entire world will benefit. Thank you. I've given you a lot to digest, and maybe that's something for everybody to be offended by. My kids are in the audience, please take it easy on me. But other than that, any questions, comments, discussion, or debate? Sir.
Sir, to what extent would joining the AIIB help both U.S. Businesses and geopolitical goals?
You know, I don't know what the AIIB at the end of the day is really intended to do. We'll have to see. I don't personally, I think it's important for China because it demonstrates that China has ascended to a point where it can create its own multilateral institutions that can aspire to be of development assistance and craft its own vision of the future. And I think that that's one more brick in building a narrative that China has emerged. That there is actually now a counterpoint to the U.S. vision of the global world order, and I wish them great good luck with it. But I don't really put that much store in those sorts of things in the world of free markets. And as far as American businesses are concerned, I don't think it's going to mean very much to many of us. Any more than the WTO or the World Bank does. You know, these are development bodies, more or less. American business is driven by the private sector, and the private sector, very few players, benefit much from organizations like that. Sir?
It seems that China has been investing in finding nations that have resources that they can exploit, and they seem to be way down the road and setting up businesses, entire towns that are going to take advantage of those and using loans to kind of manage the economy. In the U.S., it's pretty clearly our educational structure. The penetration there is huge, and while it's great to have all of that intellectual horsepower coming around, it's pretty clear they're sending them here because that's an exploitable resource. So I wonder, is there any way we're ever going to catch up with them in terms of that kind of a model for world dominance?
We have our own model for world dominance. They're sending their students here because the educational resources are here. If they were there and we wanted to copy them, we'd have to send them there. Maybe one day we will. I'd be delighted if my kids could go study at Beijing Bachelor or somewhere. But I think that we probably would be well served not to whine about problems with immigration, because with unemployment at historical lows, we actually need the workers from Mexico and Central America. And we also need the brilliant Chinese minds that study at our best universities, and it doesn't make a whit of sense to deny them visas and send them back home, does it? So let me just say that about that. As far as China's investments in natural resource extraction, I started up a mine in Yunnan province. China doesn't have, except for rare earths, it's not really a natural resource country on the level of the United States or Canada or parts of South America and Africa. It is a big country with a lot of people, and it needs resources. So going out and finding them makes a lot of sense for them. Where the resources are often harder to get to than getting them in Africa. So I think that's a smart move. I don't think we need to do it, because we've got Canada, all of North America, all of South America a lot closer. We can buy what we need. The more interesting question, where I thought you were going with this, and it's not clear at all, is not only that, but also the Belt and Road Initiative, the terms of their loans. What we really can't tell yet is, do they really want those loans repaid at all? Or is the idea to use those loans as a way of getting influence? Did I do something?
No, I'm just gonna try and turn off the sound.
Sounds nice. It's a clever backdoor way. I used to be in the distressed debt business. We make loans to companies that we hope they didn't pay it back. Or real estate, it's like making a mortgage loan for somebody you hope is not going to pay it. So you foreclose, get the real estate. It's called loan to own. Is that what China's doing? It's possible. To be smart. And to wrap the whole thing in an altruistic exterior of international goodwill and development assistance. That game hasn't played out. We'll have to see. On the surface, China needs resources, so they're going out to get them. It's the right thing to do. Can't fault them for that. Did I answer your question? Sir?
Do you read anything into the apparent Chinese effort to go away from private enterprise to divert more resources and capital into the state-owned enterprises?
That's a terrific and very difficult question. Initially, of course, everybody knows the issue that in China, under their controlled economy, everything was state-owned. And then with China's economic reform, it became a very complicated process of migrating from the state-owned enterprises into the private sector. And because all of the prices for everything and the terms of trade between everything had to be created. Because it used to be people were just told by a central planning committee what to do and how much to make and who would send it, and if they ran out of money, they would just get more money. But they had to create a whole free market economy, and they did. And they did it largely because of the pent-up entrepreneurialism of the Chinese people, who are capable of creating capital and industries and have really done a wonderful job, sometimes world leaders in certain areas. We all know about Alibaba and WeChat, and you could argue, and I would argue, that WeChat is the best thing of its kind, better than Facebook and Instagram, and that Alibaba is a terrific phenomenon destined to be in its own right kind of a world leader. That's where the dynamism is coming from on the tech side. What's happened is that that trend is somewhat reversing, because eventually there's been enough wealth created and power created inside this new capitalist system that some of the state enterprises are pushing back and demanding resources, and to a certain degree reversing the trend, largely because of their access to credit and because of their access to political power. So they can control their monopolies by having the regulators help them. They can get capital that other people can't get, starving the capital from the small and medium-sized enterprises that drive growth in our country, and funneling the capital to state-owned enterprises. Conventionally, if you believe, this is, by the way, there's something called state capitalism. Everybody familiar with that concept? That's what we call capitalism with Chinese characteristics now. We call it state capitalism. It means some kind of a bizarre marriage of communist power, one-party dictatorial power and might, to keep things on a certain path and guide growth. We're at the same time benefiting from the entrepreneurialism and creativity and wealth creation capabilities of capitalist mechanisms and capitalist companies. Nobody in history has ever done anything like this. It's a simply unprecedented experiment. It bears some relationship to kind of countries that have industrial policy, like Japan did, or like Korea did, to like build certain industries with government support, but nothing like this, where the government essentially establishes monopoly in huge segments of their economy, protects them, crushes competitors from the private sector, keeps foreigners out, regulates formally and informally to protect their monopolies. And here's what I know about China, because I've been involved with China from the opening bell, and here's what I'll tell you. Americans fall in love with China and hate with China, and in love with China and in hate with China in cycles. Sometimes the cycles are long, and we're in a long hate cycle now. But other times they're quick. Love it, hate it, love it, hate it, love it, hate it. And the thing about it is that what they love about it and what they hate about it is the same thing. It's state capitalism. Because either state capitalism is unfair competition that's crushing our companies. How can you expect our countries to compete with a whole government? That's not fair. Their spies can spy, and they can support these industries. They can lend them money. They don't care if they win money, they make money or lose money. We can't compete against that. And then they turn into state capitalism is a vestige of the old communist way of doing things. It's been proven a failure. It failed in the Soviet Union. It's failed everywhere. It's gonna fail in China. Why would you want to invest in a place like that? What's the truth? History will judge. We really don't know. I'll tell you one thing. There's a very big disconnect. I sit around with all my fellow directors of the National Committee of US-China Relations, and the CEOs and presidents and economists and university professors, and they're all saying, China's gonna grow more, China's doing great, this and that, and the other thing, we gotta watch out, China's gonna merge, US competitiveness being undermined. I'm a Wall Street guy, I say, great, why don't we just buy the stock? Because I can tell you, I have a fund that trades Chinese stocks. I would love it if everybody felt that way and they could just buy Chinese companies. But they don't want to buy Chinese companies. Nobody in America wants to buy Chinese companies. Nobody likes the stock market in China. Not in America, don't like Chinese stock market. The Chinese don't like the Chinese stock market. Why would that be? That's a failure of state capitalism. They grow, but the companies don't necessarily make money. So if you can't translate that overall GDP growth into wealth creation on the part of individuals and companies, it's very hard to invest. And if you can't create financial markets, you're in a lot of trouble. That's why all the Chinese plow their savings into real estate, because they don't trust the stock markets. They don't trust the debt markets. So the asset bubble goes up and up and up and up. The Chinese government wants to keep the real estate prices down, but there's nothing else you can trust, so people keep doing that. And this is a big problem, because here's something nobody talks about, but let me tell you. Want to know the real threat to social stability in China? They're getting old. One-child policy. When those one child grow up, their parents are old. They live in tiny homes that cost a fortune. Who's going to take care of their parents when they retire? Where are they going to go? They don't live in the commune where you just build another room on the back of your house anymore. They're living in crowded urban cities and no room. And what would you do in a developed economy? Well, you'd have wealth management, you'd have pension funds, you'd have stock markets and bond markets, 60% bonds, 40% equity. You've invested for your retirement. You know how this works. Fidelity, Burton Malkiel of Princeton has created its massive ETF industry. They don't have that in China. They're trying, but if you don't trust the markets, it's very hard to do. That is a source of social instability. So there's a lot of you can't expect 1.4 billion people to all own individual condos as a mechanism for retirement planning. That's just an insanely unworkable system, and China's going to need to fix it. And that is an Achilles heel. Demographic trends move slowly, but they're hard to reverse. Sir?
What is your opinion on the significance of the bipartisan support of the BUILD Act? And do you think it's a loan-to-own kind of economic and political tool that we're taking, or do you think it's more of trying to take back the moral high ground for this one?
The moral high ground? You guys are young and I don't want to be too cynical. But, I really think morality is a smokescreen. I don't think morality has much of a role in global geopolitics. I think that if you have shared values and shared visions and shared interests, then you cloak it in the language of morality. But I think at the end of the day, interests rule. The old saying, I think it was Henry Kissinger that said it, countries don't have friends, countries have interests. So no, I think I wouldn't be so cynical as to say that everything is about winners and losers. It's possible for both sides to win. It's possible that you could take a long view versus a short view. It's possible you can, the Marshall Plan, I think, was a moral thing to do, but it also was intended to rebuild Europe and create markets for the United States, and it worked. So was it selfish? Was it unselfish? I think it was kind of one of those things. It was moral, and it was good for everybody. The time you know when something's moral is when you do it even though it's not good for you. And I don't think that's the case. And moral high ground, that's a political position. Sorry. Ma'am.
As you describe it, there seems to be some kind of a consensus emerging among the American elites, political, economic, military, religious elites, who are more critical of China today than before. But polling data show that the American public opinion about China has not changed much. The level of American favorable feeling toward China has stayed pretty much the same. Can you please take a prediction about what might happen down the road with the trade war and all these negative media coverage of China? Down the road, would that change?
There are a lot of Chinese. Most Americans know some of them. Everybody eats Chinese food. Everybody watches kung fu movies. People like China. They like Chinese culture. They find Chinese to be good citizens, good neighbors. They're not, they're studious. Not a lot of criminals. Americans' views of China are generally guided by their direct experience of it. They go to China; it's a beautiful country, and so on. They don't understand these more complicated questions unless they're told. And then along comes Donald Trump and blames everything in the world on China. The loss of jobs? What loss of jobs? The loss of jobs. The imaginary loss of jobs. China's fault. You know, and he throws things into it that people can't understand that are true. The theft of intellectual property. That is not something that gets the people in Iowa to their feet, demanding action. It's the issue, but it's not their issue. Guess what? Apparently, it hasn't been the Russians that have interfered in our elections, it's the Chinese. That's the latest thing. So, you know, I have learned in the last 2 years, and many of you probably have too, that it's possible to stir up public opinion in all kinds of ridiculous directions based on nothing. And I think that what Americans think today could change if they're inclined to believe some line of baloney that's, you know, bumper stickered at them by the right guy, you know, in the right way. A few slogans, a few nasty nicknames, next thing you know, China is on the most wanted list. I wouldn't trust those polls. They're not reliable.
So with the tension in the South China Sea, what do you think the risk of like accidental military conflicts?
You know, I know a few admirals and generals. Everybody says the same thing. We really do not want to go to war by accident. This posturing with battleships is dangerous because even if the policy is not to do anything, things could escalate. You're dealing with battleships. There could be collisions, somebody could overreact, somebody could perceive a threat that's not there, somebody could misinterpret the action. I'm sure the policymakers don't want any conflict. China would get destroyed in a conflict today, but not always. I mean, it won't be forever before China can defend itself, at least in its own near abroad. You know, it might be quite a few decades before China can project power abroad, like what we call a blue ocean navy. It wants to have that, but it's got, what, one aircraft carrier? That doesn't pose an existential threat to the US Navy, which means, since they're not insane, China will really not provoke the United States past the point, intentionally. I personally think that everybody in a leadership position in the military that I know is more sane, rational, and careful than their counterparts in politics. So I worry more about what the White House is going to do and what Congress is going to let them do than I worry about what the Pentagon is going to do. I don't know anybody in the Chinese military. So I really don't know what's happening on the other side of the ocean. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask you in terms of this competition, one thing I've seen in China is a lack of strong federal bureaucracy, like the Security and Exchange Commission, a good postal service, Centers for Disease Control, those sort of things that the United States has, many of which are gold standards around the world. How do you think that will affect what you've been talking about?
Well, I would not, the Chinese basically invented federal bureaucracy. I don't think in the history of mankind has there been a longer functioning central bureaucracy than the bureaucracy of Imperial China. So don't underestimate their capacity to manage things like that, because they have 1.4 billion people that are not starving. Everybody gets to work, everybody gets what they need. It may not be at our standards, but it's an incredible management job. And they've been succeeding for a long, long time, all the while rising to become the world's second largest economy. That's no mean feat. The question is, do they want to? Postal Service, 20th century thing. They have WeChat. Who needs a postal service? So I don't know that's even a priority. Center for Disease Control, it's hard to imagine why they wouldn't want that. The problem with China is that everything gets political. You know, they're highly suspicious of NGOs of any kind. Quasi-governmental organizations are a strange concept in their minds. They assume the National Committee on US-China Relations is some kind of a weird extension of the US government. Just because all of our directors are former, politicians or admirals or, governors or ambassadors or whatever. But in China, there needs to be some kind of a political push, some political pressure, to do that. And there's 1.4 billion people. It's not like they get voted out of power. What is there, 70 million members of the Chinese Communist Party? Anybody know? Something like that, right? I mean, that's a pretty small percentage. So, if we had a disease outbreak that created enormous political pressure because we managed a hurricane badly, and next thing you know, a guy gets voted out of the presidency. That doesn't happen in China. So what would it take to make the Chinese be leaders in something like the CDC? It would take a plague. I mean, they'll play along because it seems worthwhile, and it isn't a matter of international respect, but to really give it an emphasis and strength in a political context like that, where you're not really responsible for your people, it's going to take some kind of a shock, just because people are people and they got other fish to fry. It's not like they don't want to. They would like to have clean air. They would like to have less pollution. They like all these things, but they also want to grow, and they want to pacify the peasants, and they just got a lot to do. They want to take over the world. Just busy. So where in that kind of a landscape does the development of these kinds of governance organization? Now, as far as the SEC is concerned, I would take issue. I think they need everything I said about their financial markets and the need for investable products and keeping the real estate values, lowering the real estate values down, and giving people alternatives. Smart people in China know this. Smart people in the Communist Party know it. Smart people in Chinese academia know it. They're trying to do it. They don't know how, and they're afraid of markets. They're just viscerally afraid of markets. They don't want us involved. Next thing you know, they're going to let foreigners start controlling, influencing their stock markets. They don't control foreigners. So, of course, the way to control foreigners is by having a good, strong SEC. Then you could let foreigners participate in your market, and we could help deepen it and professionalize it. It'd be good for them, good for us, good for the world. I sing this song all the time, every time I can get anybody to listen. They shrug their shoulders. Yeah, we know. But baby steps. I think they'll get there. I do.
How much of our country's debt does China hold?
I don't have the statistic. Is there an economics professor in this room that actually knows? People talk about it like that's a big vulnerability for us. I don't really think so. What are they going to do? Sell it?
Is there any concern that our government, led by our president, would say, maybe I'll just selectively default on some of these?
The U.S. government defaulting on its debt?
No.
Yeah, no, that's an end of the world scenario. When the U.S. government defaults on its debt, that's pretty much the end of the world as we know it. That's like predicting a comet striking the Earth and blotting out the sun. That just can't happen.
This is what our president has a history of doing.
I'm going to go back to my crazy like a fox or crazy. He does all kinds of things that seem crazy. Does that mean he's crazy? I don't know. That would be crazy. Maybe he is. I don't know. I'll say one thing. Something has to stop. Something has to change in the way that China's dealing with us. We really do need to establish a level playing field. Most people in the U.S. business community are not complaining about his dealings with China right now. Democrats, Republicans, we really think, I think, and I'm a real friend to China, I have been from the beginning, but it is time. It is time for the training wheels to come off. We don't know what to do. The Chinese Communist Party is a tough group of people. Maybe not individually, but collectively, it's ferocious. You think Donald Trump is a bully? They kill people. They take the most powerful business leaders and they just disappear. Nobody heard of them. Where'd they go? They're not afraid of him. We've got two bullies that are gonna have like a chest pounding contest. But I'll tell you, maybe that's what it's gonna take. I don't know if he's stupid or not, but I do know that he doesn't want to. I do know that he wants this fight. And if he doesn't take it too far, if he actually does make the Chinese, I don't think what we're asking is wrong. See, if I thought we were just trying to throw our weight around like we are elsewhere, then I would say, the U.S. can't just like go around the world and just beat people up all the time just because we can. But we can't beat China up. That's not what's going to happen here. I think this is a place where the Chinese, in my opinion, really should give us a level playing field. We deserve it. We have the right to demand it. It's our turn.
A question along that, you deal with a lot of Chinese communist leaders. They do things by saving faces, they have to do things gracefully on the surface. But then the way that Donald Trump does it, he's tearing up the faces. So how do you think, from your experience, what would you suggest?
Well, it's funny. I met with the transition team right after he was elected. And me and Steve Bannon had a big argument about this. We used to be colleagues at Goldman Sachs back in the day. And we yelled at each other for 45 minutes of a 15-minute meeting. Actually, I always thought at Goldman he was a very entertaining, creative guy. And I said, I'm not disagreeing with you. He said, you're disagreeing with me about everything. You love China then, you love China now. I said, you got me wrong. I actually agree with you about all of the problems that you're saying. I just never found that confronting Chinese directly in a way that makes them lose face is an effective way to deal with them. They'll win in their own minds just by saying no. Because that's already a win, because you've insulted them. Now they've dashed your hopes and they won. So on that level, I agree with you. But on the other level, I'm not sure we were going to get what we need in the old way. I'm not so sure that playing nice is actually the right strategy. I'm finding it quite entertaining to see Donald Trump and the polite Chinese way of doing things collide. I think sometimes that it's creating kind of a chemical reaction. That maybe could end up well. My concern isn't that at all. My concern is that they're going to play chicken until they collide. I think if you want to play the madman strategy, and the Chinese have already decided that you're not a madman, you're just playing like a madman, then the only way you can keep playing the strategy is to become crazier and crazier. Donald Trump will say, we're richer than you. So you're going to slap trade tariffs on us, that's 60 million. We're going to slap trade tariffs on you, that's 200 million. We win. They're going to say, oh yeah? We can't get voted out of office. We win. So who can stand it longer? That game could go. That could be a dark game. And that's what scares me. Not that the Chinese are going to lose face. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party is going to do a damn thing it doesn't have to do. So Trump's got to make them see that there's consequences. In this regard, I applaud him. I wish him good luck. Actually, for all of our benefits. Because I don't think the Chinese Communist Party is right in this one.
We have time for one more question before the webcast starts. And could we have it from a student? You look like a student.
I'm not a student here, but
Oh.
I'm a student.
Okay, that's fine. That qualifies.
You touched on briefly how North Korea and U.S. relations are kind of a chip in the calculus with China. How do you think U.S.-Russian relations also come into that calculus? And if so, how big of a chip is it?
In the economic arena, Russia is an irrelevant footnote. Russia's influence is basically, it's got a big army, and it makes a lot of mischief, and it's brutally determined to get in our face everywhere they can, because they play power politics all the time. But if you're talking about Russia and China, yes, they both used to be, communist, centrally controlled economies, and today they're not. But they took two very different paths. Russia is a kleptocracy. Everybody know what a kleptocracy is? It's a country based on stealing state assets by basically criminal gangs. I'm not a Russia expert, but I think everybody knows that. They're poor, they're getting poorer. Now, that's not the path that China took. China kept the Communist Party in charge. And people didn't just steal state assets for their own private benefit. They had just as much corruption, but it wasn't that brand of corruption. What they did is they tried to create growth and dynamism and success in China and to cut themselves in on the action. Corruptly, but still. They wanted to get a disproportionate share of their growth, not just weaken their country as long as they line their own pockets. And that's what I think the difference is. And I thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it.
I think we're experiencing a little technical difficulty, so please bear with me. Okay.
Is the volume back up? Yeah.
Us live across the United States and in China. I am Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on US-China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome audiences from 100 venues in 44 states and 3 venues in China to our 12th annual China Town Hall. Our program comes at a critical time in the relations between our two countries. While our presidents Trump and Xi initially seemed to forge a good relationship, that is now being challenged. In its national security and defense strategies, the Trump administration branded China, along with Russia, a strategic competitor and a revisionist power. It has excluded China from RIMPAC, imposed tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese exports, limited Chinese investment, restricted visas for several categories of Chinese, and debated ending Chinese student visas to the United States. Last Thursday, Vice President Pence claimed China is using a whole-of-government approach to advance its influence and benefit its interests in the United States. For its part, China continues to restrict investments in many areas, impose tariff and non-tariff barriers on U.S. imports, appropriate U.S. intellectual property, block U.S. internet and media companies from entering China's market, and violate international law in its activities in the South China Seas. In my 41 years working on Sino-American relations, I cannot recall a time when the future has been so uncertain. It is the two most important powers in the world. Cooperation between China and the United States is essential for dealing with critical transnational issues, including non-proliferation, public health, climate change, trade and investment.